Hi there, I'm Mark Isero, and welcome back to Article Club, where we read and discuss the best articles on race, education, and culture. It's August, everyone, and I hope that you're still enjoying your summer. I hope you're resting and relaxing, and I hope that you're getting some good reading done. I'm excited to discuss this month's article with you all. We're going to be reading and discussing Is the hardest job in education convincing parents to send their kids to a San Francisco public school? It was written by Gail Cornwall and published in the Hechinger Report, and it's maybe the perfect article for us to dive into as we head into the new school year in just a few weeks. I don't want to give too many spoilers because I want you to read the article and join our discussion, which will be on Sunday, August 25th. But I will say I found this article amazing in two big ways. First, it unapologetically explores all the issues and all the struggles that urban school districts are currently facing in their enrollment. And second, it profiles and celebrates the skilled and dedicated people who are working extremely hard to encourage families to send their children to public schools. So I'm excited to discuss this article with you later this month. And I'm also excited to share with you that I have not one, but two interviews for you on this podcast episode. First, you're going to hear a conversation I had with the author, Gail Cornwall. And second, you'll hear a conversation I had with the subject of the article, Lauren Kohler, who is the director of the San Francisco Unified's Enrollment Center. I really hope that you'll take in both interviews because they really complement one another and they offer rich context to what's going on in San Francisco with all of the different enrollment challenges. So first, let's start with Gail Cornwall, the author. In our conversation, we discussed a number of topics, including how Ms. Cornwall met and built trust with Ms. Kohler, how it felt to report a day in the life of the SFUSD Enrollment Center, and how racism is a prime reason for the district's enrollment challenges, and how Ms. Kohler is tirelessly working to counteract systemic inequities. So that's a little bit of it, but let's get to that interview. And then after that interview, I'll do a little intro of my conversation with Lauren. All right, here goes. Gail, thanks so much for doing Article Club.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're so excited. We are a lot of educators here at Article Club, so your piece, we totally ate it up. We have so many questions for you. First, I'm going to say the title of it is The Hardest Job in Education Convincing Parents to Send Their Kids to a San Francisco Public School. It was in The Nation and the Hechinger Report. And I guess my first question is, how'd you get into education reporting specifically? Like, we know that you were a teacher, we know that you're a mom, but why education?
That is a big question with a really long answer, but I will do my best to simplify. I had a class with Pedro Noguera my first semester of college. He is now dean at USC School of Education, and he's just an incredibly inspiring figure. And he made the case and sold me on the case that the best way to tackle our country's equity issues was through education and specifically educational access. So I always had wanted to do some sort of education policy. And then as a really naive senior in college, I was like, well, I can't go straight to teaching because I look so young and everybody's going to ask me for my hall pass all the time. And when I eventually went into teaching many years later, that did actually happen. I did get asked for my hall pass. But I was like, I can't go straight into the classroom. And, I didn't really want to do a PhD and do so many years. And so I decided because I didn't like the laws governing public education, I would go to law school and learn to write new laws, which is not what one learns in law school. Luckily, I really enjoyed the experience, but I graduated from law school and I took a teaching job coming out of law school, teaching ninth grade English. And then I practiced higher education law a little bit. And the writing piece, it's so interesting because nobody ever told me I was a good writer until I was in law school. I was really that old. So when I talk to kids now, I tell them if no one has ever told you you're good at writing, don't worry about it. You could be the most phenomenal writer. And if writing feels really hard, you're doing it exactly right. I actually started writing sort of article-like things. I started blogging when I had a kid and my daughter was sick. She was in and out of the children's hospital and I didn't want to have the same phone conversation 17 times every day, updating people. So I started a blog and then it kind of went from there where I wanted to talk about larger issues. And, that for me, the larger issues I cared about moved from parenting into education. And so I started freelancing and submitting to different places. And now I'm here now.
Yep. Well, I'm really happy, and we're really happy that you went to reporting and went to writing just because your piece is just it's just at that highest level. And so we just really appreciative of it. And I guess the second question that I have is really around this article itself. We totally know about the issue of enrollment here in the Bay Area, but how did you get to this piece? How did you get to this topic? How did you know that this was something that you wanted to write about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in writing articles, especially freelancers, you will have your own ideas, and sometimes an editor will come to you with an idea. So, my editor at the Hechinger Report came to me with the idea to write an article about pandemic era declines, specifically in San Francisco, with schools having been closed so long. Our middle and high schoolers, not all of them, there were focal groups that were able to come back, but the vast majority of our middle and high schoolers languished at home for a full 17 months with schools closed. And that did impact enrollment. And I think that your listeners might be interested in this model because folks have heard about the journalism layoffs and ad revenues being increasingly difficult. The Hechinger Report is one of several places that's actually a nonprofit that's grant funded. It used to be Columbia Teachers College, it was their journalism arm. They spun it off from the school into a nonprofit, and now the nonprofit gets grants from all kinds of foundations and whatnot. And then that's what supports reporters like me doing really in-depth investigations and supports just top-notch editors. It supports photographers. So that was the background for how we're even able to do a story of this depth. And then the other little piece of background is just I think most of your listeners know about the very politicized nature of school closures. So when my editor came to me and said, "Hey, can you do this story on pandemic era declines in San Francisco?" I responded, I can only in good conscience do this story if I'm able to take a wider lens to it because I don't think that pandemic era declines are the big story here. I think if we're talking about enrollment, that's part of the story, but it's a relatively small part of the story.
Yeah, and that was one of the amazing parts about the piece because you were sort of unafraid to talk about all of the different factors. And you did not say that it was only the pandemic. It's still a thing. Even at my school right now, we continue to blame the pandemic for every single challenge that we have. And of course, it was huge and everything. But that's one of the things that I really appreciate is that you are unafraid to sort of like look at and really report some of the other issues. And I want to get back to that. But before that, I want to get to Lauren, specifically
Mhm.
Lauren Kohler, because she was at the center of the entire thing. And you made the choice, obviously, to feature her in the entire piece. And so I just thought that was one of the most brilliant choices that you had because you had so much going on, but specifically you wanted to center her. My question is, how was it to meet her as far as first impressions? What did you notice, and how did you decide that she was the one that was going to propel the piece?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a question for anybody who's read the piece of there's so many moving pieces, right? Even as you were talking, I was thinking one of the things that I wasn't able to get into the piece but really wanted to is that SFUSC actually had a lot of departures the year after reopening because of staffing issues, right? With teachers having the COVID protocols and paras having the COVID protocols, we often had way too few adults on campus at schools. And so families did stick with the district through the pandemic. And then they left after that sort of year of chaos. Obviously, not complete chaos, but it was a year of things being less calm than they had been before the pandemic. And parents left for private schools. I didn't get that piece in, but I did get a lot of stuff in. And part of the way we were able to do it, as you mentioned, was using Lauren as the central kind of pillar organizing principle of the piece. And that just happened where I said to my editor, I got to widen the lens. I actually had already interviewed Lauren because I had been interested in this topic for several years. I had met her. I had had coffee with her and said, I'm not currently working on a piece, but I just kind of want to pick your brain. Actually, like a couple of years before this piece. And she was very nervous about, talking to me, going on record at all. And I said, well, we'll do it on background, right? I didn't say yes to my editor right away because I wanted to make sure I could do it right. So then after this idea was percolating, I went to meet with Lauren again,
Mhm.
again saying we can stay on background, but I really want to hear your thoughts on this. And then I read Rand Quinn's book, which is in the piece, and I started reading all kinds of other stuff, Tom Dee's research. Irene Lowe was mentioned in the piece. Her mentor, Al Roth, is down at Stanford, and this is about matching markets. And when instead of being, you have a good or a service that you then pay money for, it's, oh, you have sort of people and you're matching them with slots is a whole branch of economics. So I had all this stuff. And the question was, how do I communicate this stuff in a way that's a story and is a story that people can follow. I had sort of like a middle of the night epiphany actually to make Lauren and make it a profile to get all that stuff in. And I pitched it to my editor and she was like, you know what? She'd also been on the fence of whether I could widen this lens and still keep it interesting because, everybody knows about white flight. That story's been told. She said, you know what? Actually, I think that'll work. So then, this is now Lauren's now known me for a couple of years and I followed through on every promise I have made to her so far. So I said, could I just come and shadow you? Is there a day I could come and shadow you? And she said, well, we've got this orientation where we're going to be training some people. And she sort of listed other things. And she's like, and this week is really busy because it's our first week back. It's going to be so busy. And I said, oh, I'll just come be a fly on the wall. I'll just come sit there. And in the piece, you meet 10 parents, I think 36 parents total that she interacted with that day. And I went and you get a sense of it in the piece a bit, but there was even more going on than the piece gives you a sense of.
Well, I'm sure. And that was the other just brilliant organizing. So you've got Lauren, but you also have sort of like the day in the life of Lauren and the entire team. To have 24 people on a team, this is a large, important team, and you're there in such a critical time. How did you also actually talk to all these families? And how did you even like deal with, the phone calls? Like, how did it feel even being a reporter with this sort of frenziness of the day?
That's a great question. I mean, a lot of my work is getting people to trust me. A lot of the job is convincing people that I'm not there to make them look bad. I'm not there to do sort of, I gotcha, I caught you saying this thing that you wish you hadn't said, and I'm going to publish it for the whole world to see. But that was speaking to Lauren. I told her that, right? And then also, showing her some of my past work. I do a lot of solutions journalism. I do stories about students who've experienced foster care, students who've been incarcerated. And I just try to communicate that I am not there to harm any vulnerable population more. I am there to really get a fair sense of what's going on. So basically, by the time that day started, I had convinced Lauren of that, I think. And I think she would say too. And part of it is also just listening to her. Part of it is, I didn't say, oh, I'm doing this story and I need X, Y, and Z. Tell me more about this. It was a lot of just sitting at a long coffee, sitting in other meetings, and just listening to what she had to say and letting the information that she gave me and other people gave me shape the story as opposed to going in with my idea of what my story was and trying to get quotes for it, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. So just listening to her, building up trust had happened before I got there that day. She was nervous. She was clearly nervous. She is not a spotlight seeker. And many of the folks doing these sort of back office roles are not spotlight seekers. And then she sat down. We finally get started. There's a whole thing where she's ordering lunch for this staff of 24. She's doing a poll to see what lunch people want. And finally, we start talking to people, and each caller or person who comes in from the waiting room, she says, I have a reporter shadowing me today. Would you mind if she listens in? And every single one said, no, it's no problem. People they just want their question answered, right? So, no, it's no problem. And I also told people, I will not use your name unless I have talked to you beforehand. It's not that letting me listen to this conversation makes it fair game for me to write about. So then I listened to them. And there was one person who asked me, I think in the piece I refer to her as a woman who had sent a vitriolic email, who asked midway through. It was just sensitive information. I totally understood, asked me to leave, and that was totally fine. But for the most part, people also involved in this process feel like they're being chewed up and spit out by a big machine. So they want to be seen too. A lot of people actually wanted me to witness their pain with this process, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I can see also why Lauren would be nervous, as well as maybe some of the parents, probably wanted to be seen. But, I think that there's always going to be a little bit of leeriness with any reporter. And specifically, as you named in the piece, there are journalists who sort of try to do sort of like, not necessarily hit jobs, but like sometimes there is some negativity in the schools. And obviously, SFUSD has had its challenges. It would have been much easier, I guess, to not be as expansive as you were. And it just really is a testament to your ability, not just to write, but to be able to see the entire picture of what's going on in SFUSD. So thank you. And if it's okay, I'd like to sort of get into a little bit of the different challenges that you noticed, as well as that Lauren is facing, in the piece about how is it possible that you were able to meaningfully talk about some of these challenges. It was just really quite skillful. So just to name a few, you did talk about the pandemic. You talked about private schools. You talked about charter schools. You talked about things like the lottery itself, the process. You talked about like great schools and how websites make it difficult. And then, of course, you talk about not just the racism, right now, but also the history of sort of like enrollment and racism. And I guess my question is sort of like, how did you approach figuring out how to fit that all in a meaningful way that would not bog down the reader? And do you remember any specific choices that you made in order to make it coherent?
Yeah. So when you learn to write in school, a lot of what I would do is I would sort of say something, like spell it out, like say a parent who has their kid in private school gets really used to the perks of private school, gets used to the community. Like once you lose them to private school, it's really hard to get them back into public schools, right? So I could use words typing that, but instead what I did is I used David to show that. Right. So I never explicitly say that, but the reader sees that happen with David. And I tried to do that with a lot of the characters in the story to have them stand for a larger phenomenon that's happening with a lot of parents. But that gives you sort of an economy of words too, right? Because you don't have to explicitly state so many things if you're showing it through people's stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like you were dealing with these huge issues, but obviously like really humanizing them because day to day, like they're both enormous social issues, but like you're dealing with real families and real kids going to real schools. So that's like, I felt like there was a groundedness, in your writing. I guess I wanted to know like which out of these 6 or 7 factors, and I probably even didn't list all of them, you said that the pandemic was important, for example, but not necessarily the whole story. Like from your reporting, what do you feel stood out the most, being there that day, but then also in your research before and after?
So there's no question that population decline is a huge part of the problem. It's about half on the numbers. About half of the decline in public school enrollment was fewer children in the city of San Francisco. Another piece of it is the private schools and racism and racial bias and racial fear all tied up together in what makes parents who can afford a choice choose private. Others choose parochial schools. When I say private, I mean the schools that have dubbed themselves independent schools and also parochial schools. But those are pretty different populations. So that's a huge part of it. There's no question in my mind. There's one study I cited about when white, more affluent parents in a region are choosing private school, that signals to other people that the public schools aren't good enough. And there's a real psychological incentive once people are paying a ton of money for a private school to tell themselves and tell others that they have to. They didn't have another choice. This was the only acceptable option. And so then there's a lot of public school bashing that happens. So there's a reputational issue. And the press thing really does feed into that because I agree with Lauren that the press coverage of SFUSD is more negative than any other city I've lived in. I've lived in Boston and read the coverage there, New York, the coverage there, even following the coverage in Chicago from afar. I lived in Seattle, followed the coverage there, and it's really pretty negative here. You don't see a lot of success stories about SFUSD, and this is new this week that SFUSD is acknowledging these racial incidents that have happened after a Chronicle article came out. Well, this week also, there is a private school in the city, which I won't name, that has discovered swastikas drawn in the hallways, drawn on desks. But that kind of story doesn't make the news, in part because
Mhm.
private schools are better at sweeping it under the rug and it not getting to reporters. And in part, and this is understandable on behalf of the reporters, when you're writing about a school that size, it's only impacting 1,000 kids. When you're writing about SFUSD, we're talking about 45,000 kids. It feels like a bigger story. So I think I would put all of that reputational bundle together. And then I would say population decline. And then the third piece of it, which the piece does get at, is there are real problems with SFUSD's process. This game theory stuff, the matching market stuff there are real inefficiencies that mean that the process stumbles over itself. And even a family that's eager to go to public school could end up in private school just because of all the issues with the process.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, I know of families that just say that the entire process is sort of broken. And I know that you said in your piece that it's going to be revamped, but also that it's been revamped in the past. Of course, I'm not a parent, I'm not a family. And so, therefore, I know that there's a lot of instances where you don't get in and maybe you should have. But when I saw in your piece that 25% of kids in San Francisco go to private school, which is
Mhm.
way more than the 8% that you said in California, Like, I knew that a little bit, but that was just so staggering. And you talked about the history of that as well. And I liked how you were not afraid. You basically just said that this is a thing where we all know that San Francisco is famously progressive, but sort of like as long as my kid is not sitting next to a black kid in the same classroom. And I know that Lauren can't do anything about that because her whole
Mhm.
point is to get more people into SFUSD. And you also talk about how she really says, like, I'm sure that that's really difficult for you. And she does de escalation training with her staff. But I just feel like sometimes like, what are we supposed to be doing when part of the truth really is racism?
That's an excellent question. And I will back up sort of your impulse that sometimes this process thing is real and sometimes the process thing is an excuse. And the stat, again, I'm not going to name the school, but this is a San Francisco public school, not this cycle, but the site enrollment cycle before, almost 40% of the kids who were assigned to this school, which is one of the top demand, most popular SFUSD schools, right? Almost 40% of the families assigned in the first round, which means they found out before they had to tell a private school, opted out of the public schools. So that means these parents got their first choice public school and they still decided to go private. And then it's a question of why is that happening? And I do think racism is part of it. And racial fear, racial bias are real in this city. And, that's kind of part of the point of the story is like, there's some pieces of this that this woman can be working so hard and consulting these Stanford professors. And then there are these problems that what is she supposed to do, right?
That's what I was trying to get at too. Like, you talk about all the things she's trying to do, and I still was left with this thing about, like, what is she supposed to be doing? You have the scene with the newcomer family, you have the scene with obviously the private school families or whatever. And I had so much empathy also for her and her entire department, which is sort of like, what exactly is she supposed to be doing and with what strategies? And you
Mhm.
mentioned a whole lot of stuff, especially, with this research from Stanford and sort of like figuring out new ways to get more families in there. But it seems like she just is not like there's no way for her to actually like deal with some of the more systemic social issues. Did you get a sense? I mean, she seems to be so filled with energy and so strong, but did you get a sense of ultimately what her motivation was, as well as how she keeps up the hope, in this job?
That's a great question. I mean, what you see of her in the article is what I perceived of her. Her energy really seems to come from wanting to do the right thing and do right by the most number of kids and the kids who have faced the most disadvantages in their lives. And I think she just is energized because she thinks it's really important. There was a quote, I didn't get into the piece. It was a quote from Irene Lowe. I'm going to see if I could find it. But basically, I asked Irene, she's the one that's using these tools that have been used before when we talk about, we've tried quotas, we've tried set asides, we've tried zones, right? We've tried all these things. And like, why does she keep at it? And her answer was because the problem is so incredibly important. Even if you're only making small gains, it's worth keeping at it.
Yeah, and now, it's the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board as
Right.
well. And I don't know, like, I'm in a school and we know that public education continues to be really challenging to the point where, unfortunately, sadly, there's a little bit of cynicism that I'm definitely been aware of. And it's just at this point, with like the idea of public schools being attacked from so many different directions, it's really wonderful when you have somebody like her, just doing all of the work to stay hopeful. I guess I wanted to ask you that as sort of one of the last questions is you've cared about education, you've reported on it. What makes you stay in it? And how do you feel about the state of public education?
I think this question brings sort of a lot of the things we've been talking about back full circles. One of you'll notice that there was the initial day, and then you'll see that I followed up with a bunch of parents and found out sort of how they were thinking 2 months later, how they were feeling 3 months later. And part of the way that I convinced these parents to keep talking to me and many of them to use their full names in the piece was by convincing them that they were doing a public service, that improving this system, shining a light on this problem and potential solutions would be doing a public service in the same way that Pedro Noguera convinced me all those years ago. And I think that is really what we need to make the Brown v. Board vision happen is people need to have a sense of civic responsibility. I think in San Francisco in particular, there's a lot of progress we can make on PR. I think when people are in these schools, this is the number one thing I tell parents looking at schools. I say, go to the school, experience the school, see these kids, see their teachers, because that is, in my experience, the only way around the bias and the fear that comes with the test scores, or parents look up the racial breakdown online. Go to the school, right? And see what these kids are like. See the joy, see the progress, see. I do tours as a parent. I lead tours for a San Francisco public school. And that's a lot of the messages like, look at how much fun is being had and how much academic progress is being made, how many social emotional skills these kids are picking up. When you see a kid say, actually, I'm going to use my walk away power right now, that's huge. And people need to see that with their own eyes. And PR needs to be more effective because there's a lot of success happening in SFUSD and in other urban public schools that just isn't being seen by a lot of people. But I don't think that alone is enough. I think people also need to feel a sense of civic responsibility around investing in public schools, both as voters and sending kids there.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you for your magnificent piece. Thank you so much for being part of Article Club.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
All right. I hope you appreciated that conversation with Ms. Cornwall. I really thought it made clear not only how much of an expert she is on this topic, but also how compassionately she approaches her reporting and writing. So thank you. All right, so now I'm really happy to share with you the conversation I had with Ms. Kohler, the director of the SFUSE Enrollment Center and the subject of the piece. Obviously, you've already heard a little bit about her from Ms. Cornwall and how amazing she is, and so it was a delight to get to interview her too. In our conversation, we talked a lot about a ton of issues, including how Ms. Kohler felt when she first got this job, how she makes decisions about allocating the enrollment center's resources, and how she approaches engaging white families on their decision-making process. All right, here's that conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much for being on Article Club.
Thanks for having me here.
It was really amazing to read the piece and just to sort of know that you were the highlight, like you're at the center of this whole piece. And so we have all these questions. I wanted to go back to 2020 when you first got the job. We know where you were and also sort of a little bit about your background. Do you remember how it felt even to go through the interviewing process and to even get that job? Can you share with us how it was?
Of course, I spoke a few times with the previous executive director, whose name was Jeff Kang, who is an extremely smart guy who is really excited about doing different things at the enrollment center. And my last interview was with Orla O'Keefe, who was then the chief of policy and operations, I think, and with some of the counselors from the counseling team here at the enrollment center. And I think I remember talking to them about culture because culture is a really important thing to me in jobs. And they talked about how it's sort of like a family here. And I think that that's very true. Everybody has your back and they might have little disagreements about things, but it's just a really warm, loving place to work.
Did you have any idea, though? I mean, you were hired during the pandemic, sort of at the beginning, but you could not have known, even though SFUSD, of course, is going to have some challenges, maybe just systemically around enrollment.
Mhm.
Like, can you even predict what your job was going to be now?
No, not at all. I think what I wanted to do when I started working at SFUSD was figure out how to make our enrollment process more equitable and more accessible to low income families, to African American families, to Latino families. But I had no idea that our enrollment was going to drop by 5,000 students since I started. And so it's been a really different world than I thought we would be in.
Yeah, and then meanwhile, up recently, you get in contact with this writer, Gail, and you basically have to sort of decide whether or not to say yes to her. And we did chat with her, and she said that actually you knew of her and you had sort of talked to her a little bit over time, like you sort of
Yeah.
knew her a little bit. But I wanted to ask just like, why would anybody in your position say yes to a journalist to like come in and interview you and shadow you?
So I interacted with Gail a couple of times. She's a parent at one of our schools at Rooftop Elementary. And I had interacted with her a couple of times about their tour forms and things like that. She's really thoughtful and very kind. And I got a good vibe from her. And so I think that when she said she wanted to write about enrollment and sort of the things that were hard and the different things that we were trying to do, I appreciated that frame because it is very hard, but we are trying to do a lot of different things.
Yeah, it seems like there was some sort of trust there. I mean, this is not just coming to profile you, but also you have a team of 24, and obviously SFUSD is a major district, and there's like national sort of like people looking at you. So I am really interested. It's like sort of like, why did you go for it? And is there something that she did, or is it something about you that sort of said, hey, let's just go for it?
I think Gail has a very calming presence and just her obvious desire to not write a gotcha article. She sort of like said, I understand that this is really hard and I want to sort of capture the background work. And I think that that was really helpful for me in building trust. But I also think that for me, a lot of the information that exists about the enrollment work in San Francisco is pretty bleak, and it's mostly folks who are really frustrated with the system. And so I thought that having people see like the other side of it, what our counselors do, how we're working with families to support them would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, reading the piece, so obviously I'm a career educator, also been in the Bay Area, and thought I sort of knew the inner workings. And yet I learned a whole lot, especially with how she wrote it. Like she was able to talk about a lot
Mhm.
of different things in a short period of time. And of course, she's not going to get into the nuances of the lottery system and the enrollment
Mhm.
process. But I thought it was really amazing how she even organized the piece, sort of like a day of. How was it when she actually she came to visit you and shadow you for a day, right?
That's right. So she and I had talked a handful of times, and she asked if she could come and watch the work in our office. And I suggested that she come a couple days before the first day of school because that's one of the times when we see the most families with the most different situations. So I thought it would be the most interesting. But it is also like I think a little bit overwhelming because it's basically a day where we work from 8 to 5 without a lot of break in between. And so I think it's like an accurate view of what our team is doing during the busiest times of enrollment, which is probably 6 months of the year. It's very busy here.
So it seems like even though it was stressful, it wasn't necessarily because she was there.
That's right.
There's something about I mean, we have just met, but, like, the idea that you not only said yes, but you said, "Oh, yeah, come to one of the most challenging." Like, there's something about you and sort of, like, your overall approach and orientation there, which I think also speaks to, obviously, like, what kind of person and skill set, to be in your position to, like, basically really lead this team in enrollment in SFUSD, so I just appreciate that.
Thank you. That's very kind. I have the best team, and I don't think I understood fully that the article would be so focused on me. And I was really excited for somebody to see like the amazing work that our team does. And I know she spent some time talking to one of our ladies who does intake. So when families come in and describe the issue that they're trying to solve, she helps them figure out who on our team to talk to. And so I was a little surprised when it was she told me she was shadowing that it would be more focused on me. And I was surprised, but I think that I'm still glad that we did it, and I think it shows the work that our team is doing in a really positive light.
Yeah, I really appreciate how the article was dealing with so many issues and then how you were sort of
Mhm.
really approaching them. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about it. I mean, she talks about the pandemic, she talks about the issue of private schools, the racism that's obviously
Mhm.
endemic in all of this, charter schools, even like the technical aspects about the internet with great schools and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And, I guess I wanted to ask you sort of like, how do you even approach sort of like how to come up with metrics and goals with your team to figure out like what would be successful on any given year, given all of these various challenges that you face?
That's an interesting question. I think we do a goal setting meeting every year, and the things that we think most about are sort of the proactive pieces. So we look at common challenges that we see and we think about how might we change our policy or our process to address those things and what is it that we're hoping to see at the end of it. Next year, instead of having many different rounds where families resubmit their applications over and over again, we'll do one main round, and then everybody who's already applied will go on a wait list. And then as families come in late, we'll add them to the wait list in the place that they should be based on the tiebreakers. And we'll also assign them to a school that has openings. The goal is to increase enrollment by helping more families feel excited about their assignment early on, because we know we have many families who are continuing to push forward with the systems. They're submitting their application to us many times while also considering private schools. The goal was like, how do we help those people feel secure in the fact that they'll get something that they're excited about at SFUSD from the first time that they hear from us about their school assignment? And so our goal there is to increase enrollment. We have a specific number that we're aiming for, which is, I think, probably not very important. But we think about how we change the process to get to that end every year. And a lot of the work that most of our team does is thinking about how we do outreach to different specific groups of parents so that they can hear and feel excited about SFUSD. So we had folks on our team who came up with our school tour form, which is how I met Gail actually, because she was the person who was sort of running the school tour form for Rooftop. But it used to be families called the schools, called every school they wanted to go on a tour of, and like found out the times. And then they were trying to organize all of that information. And as you might imagine, most of our low income families and lots of families of color were not able to navigate the many different calls. So somebody on our team came up with the idea of like, we'll make the links, we'll put them all in one place, and then we'll work with the schools to like run the tours once they're already set up. And so somebody does that. We have a lot of counselors who are thinking about, okay, what groups of parents do we want to talk to? What influencers can we talk to about what's going great at this school and take them on tours? And then how do we go to families in the Mission, families in the Bayview who might not understand the process or hear about the process early enough so that they're able to participate really early? I think it's a lot of just like continually examining what we do, but a lot of our metrics are sort of on the front end. Like, how do we get people to know and understand and then be excited early on?
How do you like figure out those are amazing as far as all the different campaigns, and how do you figure out which things to put more resources into? It's hard to figure out effectiveness too, right?
Yes, it's really difficult to figure out which things are most effective. We're in such a limited resource situation in San Francisco. I think that the places that we spend our largest amount of team resources are on our families who are most marginalized. So we're spending most of our team time doing presentations only in Spanish or only in Cantonese, doing lots of presentations at schools in the Bayview. And we have an office in the Bayview also, trying to make sure that we're supporting our families who need the most support. So that's where I would say we spend the most resource. However, we do focus also on things that impact a broad swath of families. So the school tours form is a thing that impacts many, many families. I think we had more than 10,000 families go on a tour last year. So things like that, things like changing the way that we're doing our process, those are things that impact many people.
Yeah, I appreciate, obviously the lens on equity and also around marginalized populations. You want to make sure as a public district, of course, that there are many access points and it's truly democratic. And yet, also in the article, Gail's talking about the percentage of kids in San Francisco who go to private schools being 25%, which is apparently way over the state average of 8%. And so it would seem like one of your primary audiences or sort of theories of action would be, hey, let's try to convert. These are not only white families, of course, but socioeconomically, one could also argue that it's predominantly white. And so, how do you balance that? How do you balance that in your work and your strategy?
Yeah, I think the school tour form is certainly something that's more exciting to more affluent families generally. Like they're much more likely to go on a school tour if they're considering both public schools and private schools. And so I think that for things that impact a large number of people early on tends to necessarily be aimed at converting some of those folks, right? So like having the school tours work better and be more standardized is something that we hope would convert more of those people. Having people be more excited about their main round assignment as early as possible and not having those people have to continue to submit applications is something that I suspect is probably not more attractive. I suspect it's because the affluent families are participating earlier, like a disproportionate number of affluent families will benefit from getting an assignment they like earlier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Which gets me thinking you have been talking about all of the work that you have been and will continue to do to simplify the process, also to make sure that the information is there. It looks like you're going to be advocating for a major overhaul of the actual system of enrollment. How much is your scope on the specific technical aspects? versus some of the other things that you may want to have advocacy around with regard to all of the possible policy changes that could be happening at the district? Like, is your scope sort of like, let's make this better and easier for families? Or like, is there other, like, are there other avenues as well?
I do think that policy change is a major way that we think about this that is sort of different because you're right. Generally, the changes that we make in our office are technical. How do we change the process? How do we make these steps feel easier or more accessible to people? How do we make sure that everybody has information? I think that changing the policy is one of the biggest ways that changes the composition of kids in our schools potentially and the resources of families in schools and the resources that are available to different families in different schools. So I think that that's one of the most exciting parts. And as we look at statistics on how we might change the policy, one of the top things that we look at is does this make the schools more diverse? And then we look at things like is it making schools closer to home for families? Are we able to assign more families to something that they're excited about? So it's sort of like all of those things. But one of our first lenses is always can we make our schools more diverse? Because that's a better learning environment for students.
Which can happen obviously with technical, and it can happen with policy shifts, even though the
Right.
policy shifts might be a little bit more challenging politically. But like, how much of your work is actually in hearts and minds work? Because like in the article, you talk about, like Gail talks about all these families and how you talk to them, how you have empathy for them, how you listen, how you say how difficult it is. But ultimately, it's also the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board, and the
Right.
history is in there. And ultimately, there are unfortunately many families who may, white families in particular, who may not want their white kid to be in a specific school just because of
Yeah.
the composition. So, how in your office, what can you and what have you tried to do about just the glaring notion of San Francisco?
Yeah, I think that one of the conversations we practice with families every year before we send out the main round assignments, which we do in March, is sort of probing into why they're not happy with whatever their assignment is and helping them think through reasons that the issues that they're having with the school might not necessarily be real issues. So I think a lot of times families will say safety. And so we'll pull up like the school's culture and climate report and look at it with them and be like, oh, well, this is actually really close to the level of safety that students feel at other schools. I'm not sure that that's like particularly impactful, but at least we're trying to help them like see the facts that are part of their narrative and examine whether they're caused by actual facts or by some lens that they're bringing to it otherwise, which in our case, unfortunately, often includes racism.
I think it's great that you do that. They must know what you're trying to do too, though.
I think that's true. And I think that for many families, as I think Yael captured in her article, many of them, when we say like, "Oh, this school would be great if your child's really interested in like a college preparatory program, like Mission High School has the highest UC acceptance rate in the city. This would be a great school for your kid." And a lot of families are still not interested in that. I think they recognize it, but I'm not sure that it is working yet.
Well, and the thing is also, I don't know, it's hard also because these are potential families and clients of yours. Like, how much do you actually tell the truth? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, you don't actually have an ongoing conversation and relationship with them.
Right.
It's not like even though hearts and minds do need to be changed, like your role, like it would be very challenging too. So I can see
Right.
strategically how you might want to have sort of like a light touch of like interrogating a little bit, planting some seeds, but it might be having an overblown approach sometimes might actually be maybe negative. What do you think?
I tend to agree with you. I think that I have been more direct with families in the past and found that that's just really off putting for them. So I think we do a little bit more of the questioning approach now. That said, though, I think that when we finally start to change the elementary assignment policy, we need to have a lot of more of the city's like hearts and minds bought into this. And so I think that there's potentially a really large community engagement effort that we need to be doing in our team when we start getting ready for the policy change.
Yeah, and quite frankly, also sort of like if we as an entire Bay Area and specifically for the residents and families in San Francisco, and also with the affluence that's there, and also sort of like with what we see as like racial discrepancies, at some point, white people will have to sort of like tell white people, not just in your role, but also
Right.
families and educators about actually like what the truth is, because as we know from the data, once there's actually more of an investment in schools, the schools are going to get better as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's a difficult chicken or egg problem, right? When you assign families to the schools, can you get them to go there knowing that just having a more diverse environment will necessarily make the school more appealing to a more diverse set of families?
Right, totally. Well, thanks for this. I have just a question or two left. And one of them is sort of like, so you're getting into next year. What are you feeling good about going into next year? And what are you really working on?
I'm preparing for next year being a very challenging year because at some point next school year, the school district will announce schools for closure. The board will vote on them, I think, in December. And I think that that will be really stressful and difficult for families and will lead them to come here and be looking for different schools to enroll in, which I think will be just, it will be a lot of hard conversations with families as they're going through that. And I think it will also be hard because we're going to make a major change to our process. And every time we do something different, it introduces a level of unknownness in a way that is confusing for folks and sometimes really stressful. So, oh, I don't have round two statistics from previous years that I can compare my chances to anymore because you guys got rid of round two. What does that mean for my chances of getting in off the wait pool at this school? And so I think that those two things together are making for a really difficult year. And so we'll spend some time with our team this summer thinking about all the little scenarios that will come up and how we want to handle them. But I would say I am feeling very good about the change that we are planning to make to our process. I think it's the right thing to do, even if it's a difficult thing.
Mhm.
And I talked to my team about like, is this too much? Is this too difficult a time to make this? And they were like, but it will be so good for families that even if it's like complicated in many ways, it seems like we should always be doing the thing that's good for families as early as we can.
Yeah.
So I fully support that view, and which is why we're going to do it. But I do think it will be tough.
Yeah. My last question is what keeps you committed? And I mean, this is challenging work. You've been at this job for a while. Like, what
Mhm.
keeps you passionate and committed in this work?
Our families. I love when we're able to help a family go to a school that they're excited about, or when we assign them to a school that they're not excited about, then they go and then they really like it. I think that those things make me feel really happy. And also helping our families who are newcomers to the country and we're able to find them like a program that will support them in their needs. And then our team is just like a wonderful family. And I think if it was different folks every year, or it wasn't quite so much like a family, I think it could be really stressful. But in general, I really like coming to work and I like the people that I come to work to. Even though there's hard parts about it, it's really just like a wonderful environment to work in.
It's great. Thank you, Lauren, so much. Thanks for your generosity and talking to us. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you for making time. I appreciate it.
I'd like to thank Gail Cornwall and Lauren Kohler yet again for generously saying yes to doing this interview for Article Club. And listeners, I'd like to thank you too for listening, and I hope you like these conversations. If you did like them, I invite you to come to our discussion on Sunday, August 25th. We'll be on Zoom starting at 2 p.m. Pacific Time, and you can sign up at highlighter.cc/discussion. If that's not your thing, please feel free to do all the other things. You can share Article Club with your friends, rate this podcast 5 stars on Apple, subscribe to the newsletter, or even get a paid subscription. You can do all of that at articleclub.substack.com. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great weekend ahead.